Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Slash Filmcast. And this is a special bonus episode about Avengers Endgame. So over the course of the last couple weeks, I've released a few episodes about Avengers Endgame. Have had a fun time talking with a lot of different people about it. So I've kind of recorded roughly like 5 hours worth of conversations about Avengers Endgame, put them onto the internet, on the Slash Filmcast feed, and on YouTube. And I was kind of ready to put the whole thing to bed and like not talk about Avengers Endgame forever. But I read a couple pieces this week that really made me feel like I needed to have at least one more meaningful chat about this film with some very intelligent folks. So that's what I'm here to do today on the Slash Filmcast. You can find more episodes of this podcast at slashfilmcast.com and email us at slashfilmcast@gmail.com. Joining me today, she is a staff writer and film critic at slashfilm.com. Huai Chen-Bui, welcome to the Slash Filmcast. How are you doing today, HT?
I'm good, good. How are you?
I'm doing well. Glad to have you here. And also, Ingu Kang is a staff culture writer at slate.com. Ingu, welcome to the Slash Filmcast. How are you doing today?
Hello. I won't ask you how you're doing because I don't really care.
Thanks. Thank you. I appreciate the realness. I was watching one of my favorite movies before sunset, actually, recently. And it's interesting, like, Julie Delpy in that movie talks about how, she misses America because Americans are all into that bullshit of, like, how's your day? And, like, oh, I'm doing great, and all that stuff. And it didn't occur to me until she said that that's a distinctly American, like, small talk is a distinctly American thing because we've grown up with it our whole lives. Anyway, I know that's probably not what you were commenting on, but I just wanted to throw that out there that, like, in other parts of the world, no one gives a crap how your day is going.
No, it's actually Julie Delpy and me, spiritual brain twins.
Well, in any case, the pieces that you wrote that really struck a chord with me were at slate.com. Ingu wrote this piece called "The Worst Scene in Endgame is the One That's Supposed to Be the Most Feminist." And also at slashfilm.com, HT wrote a piece called "The Women of Marvel Deserved More in Avengers Endgame." And we'll link to both of those pieces in the show notes. And before we begin, we should say we're going to spoil everything in Avengers Endgame. So if you have not seen Avengers Endgame, you should wait until you've watched the movie, come back, and listen to this podcast. So before we get to these pieces, I kind of am curious to hear your overall thoughts on Avengers Endgame. Ingu Kang, what did you think about the film overall, girl power moment aside?
I thought it was fine. I think I've seen about 2/3 of the MCU movies. And I definitely know that there were like certain beats I didn't really get because I hadn't seen those other movies. But I had seen enough movies that like the stuff that was sort of supposed to land, some of the stuff that was like supposed to land like landed really well for me. And I thought like, this movie has like the responsibility of wrapping up storylines and emotional beats from 21 other movies. And I think it does as well as it can within like the parameters it's given. And for like a 3-hour movie, it's actually pretty zippy.
Yeah.
So all of that was like all very good. And I think like the one thing I wasn't super expecting is that, so like the movie has like a bunch of like bigger scenes where everyone comes together, and those are usually pretty terrible because like you don't know what you're supposed to look like, you don't know what you're supposed to look at, and there's generally like too much stuff happening.
It's like they're fighting like CG zombie hordes or something like that usually,
yeah.
Right? Yeah.
But then in the scenes where it's just like one-on-one, you remember, oh, Marvel actually cast a bunch of like really terrific actors, some of whom have really great chemistry with one another. And I think like the fact that like these people have worked with one another for as long as like 10, 11 years, it really pays off by this point.
So it sounds like you overall found it to be mildly enjoyable, if I'm pegging your opinion correctly.
I would say even moderately enjoyable.
Moderately enjoyable. Excellent. All right. HT, your overall thoughts on Avengers Endgame?
I actually found it to be really enjoyable, which I found a pleasant surprise, especially after Avengers Infinity War disappointed me greatly. And I think Avengers Endgame is kind of a miracle of a movie in that it is able to stand alone and stand strongly as its own film, and that has something to say about grief and regret and loss, while tying in 10 years worth of storytelling. And that really was amazing to me. I enjoyed a lot how the first act of the film, especially, uh, took it slow, and it was quite almost meditative in the way that it approached the fallout of Thanos' snap and everything. And I thought that that was so unusual for a superhero blockbuster these days, and something so bold, especially for a film that people have been anticipating so much. And I like that it was willing to just kind of take things in stride in that regard. And even when it like turns into two other movies in the second and third act, I enjoyed all of those things. Like the second act with the time travel shenanigans, which were really fun and zippy, as Ingu said. And then the third act, which is the big battle and could have easily descended into visual noise, was really dynamic. And there are some parts that do feel a little bit like CG punching each other, but the big moments in the battle really tie together, and it's all also something that really pays off all of that storytelling from the past 10 years. So I like a lot that we can see this movie as just a good movie on its own, but also a product of 10 years, 23 films worth of storytelling.
So there is a moment in the final battle that both of you wrote about at Slate and /film.com, and kind of you use that moment to interrogate more about how the MCU as a whole has treated women, right? And it's this moment that, you both describe it so well. I'll read Ingu's description of it here. There's one bit of fan service that couldn't land more gracelessly if it were tossed off the cliff on Vormir. During the final showdown with Thanos for the fate of the universe, Captain Marvel, Valkyrie, Okoye, the Wasp, and several other female characters get information, presumably for audiences to rally around Marvel's commitment to gender equality and women's representation. Instead, the scene immediately revealed itself as the apotheosis of the studio's expectation that fans of female superheroes be satisfied with scraps while courting woke points for its supposed forward thinking. So I will just describe like my reaction to the moment, and then I will turn it over to you because I want to hear what your thoughts are. But when I was watching that moment, it's like I think the feeling I had in the theater was like, this is not for me, and I don't mean like it's not like something I would enjoy, but like it clearly felt like it was targeted at the women in the audience, and. So I wasn't like, yeah, go, or I wasn't like, ooh, that's pandering. I just feel like it's I don't even feel like I have standing to react to it, if that makes any sense. Like I don't feel like it's because it's not for me. It's not really something that I feel good about saying, even whether I like it or not. I will say that my wife turned to me and kind of made the gagging motion, like she felt it was extremely pandering and gross. And it feels like her opinion of it lined up with what you both expressed in these pieces. So, Ingu Kang, say more about your reaction to that moment. Like, as you're watching it, what was your reaction? Because you obviously put some thought into it after we wrote this piece, but like in the theater, what was your reaction?
Probably just rolling my eyes. I mean, I think this is one of those things where I don't think that I would have really cared about. I think in a big sense, I think that like we all know that the Marvel movies have a gender problem. It took like 10 years for Marvel to have its first female-headed superhero movie. And so...
Right, you say Marvel put out 20 movies with male protagonists, many of them brain-meltingly similar to one another, which I thought was a great Ingu Kang turn of phrase.
And so I think this like observation that Marvel has a gender issue is like not interesting. The thing that like really got at me and like niggled inside and like made it a thing that like I felt like I should write about is the fact that like when that scene happens, it's so obviously calculated for not only the people in the audience to like applaud, but then also for the audience to associate Marvel movies like Marvel as a franchise, as like this like big feminist franchise. And that was the thing that like really got me, because it wasn't just like a girl power moment to me. It was like a branding exercise.
Mm-hmm.
And so if they hadn't done that, I don't think that I would have really cared about like the gender dynamics of like a movie that I already know is like working in this like very heavily flawed structure. But like the fact that Marvel really wanted people to cheer on like characters like Mantis and Pepper Potts in a blue Iron Man suit, I was like, are you fucking serious? I'm not gonna fucking cheer for this. Where's Pepper Potts' movie? Give me that and then I will cheer. Where
is Pepper Potts, ascension to the CEO of Stark Industries, and like that whole movie and that whole process? Like, she has whole journey. She has whole journeys that are occurring off screen, right, between these movies. But
I think the other thing is that like this gap that Marvel says it's trying to fill, it's something that like Marvel has created by its like on its own, like no one forced Marvel's hand in having no female protagonists. And so to me, this is like gangster logic. Like you break into someone's store and then you want to get credit for there to be no more break-ins in your store.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's gross.
Yeah,
that's a hilarious analogy, and I love it.
So it sounds like you wouldn't have written this piece if you had just seen the movie and this moment didn't happen, right?
No,
but
though I did have issues with like the way the movie treated its two female characters,
right? But Nebula and Black Widow specifically, right?
Yes.
But because of this scene, kind of positioning Marvel as woke, as committed to representation, given Marvel's track record, you found it particularly galling. And that's kind of like, I guess if you could, this is a question I'm curious about, right? And this is, I'm curious for both of you to answer this question.
Can I add something to what you were just saying, though?
Please, yeah, go ahead.
It's interesting to me that like this moment is like not only the moment that like they were trying to like trump up. I think there's like a scene during like the first act, Leftovers act, where basically one of the characters in Captain America's therapy group is like revealed very casually to be gay, and it's played by one of the Russo brothers, who are the brothers who directed the movie. And basically they hype it up as like, apparently the quote they used was exclusively gay moment. And they also wanted woke points for featuring Marvel's like first gay character or something along these lines. It's like this, I don't know, like appropriation, for lack of a better word, of like social movements to try to like use as part of their marketing campaign. And like, number one, like gross. Like, again, you're the ones who didn't include all of these like other groups in the first place. And that's why like you filling in like the lack that you created is like already gross. But
see, that moment would have worked too if the Russo brothers hadn't come out afterwards and patted themselves on the back about it, because it was a nice, quiet moment. Yeah.
Well, I understand what you're saying. Like the one thing I do want to just make clear though, like when you say marketing, I mean I think we're talking like the PR campaign, right? Like specifically around what the press cycles around this movie are, right? And like what people have been writing about the movie. Like it's not necessarily in the trailer that there's like a gay character or that there's this girl power moment, but like it is part of the overall like narrative of the movie that has been put out there. So that's like a very minor, attenuation of what you're saying, but I did want to clear that up.
Yeah,
I wouldn't say this movie. I would say Marvel as a franchise. I think where a lot of this comes from is like from the success of Black Panther, because I mean, not only like was Black Panther like a great movie, but obviously, Ryan. I am blanking on the director's name.
Coogler?
Yes, Ryan Coogler did a lot of like different elements of Black culture that he like put into that movie, like Afrofuturism and like Black feminism, and basically made this really wonderful movie. And I think what the marketing department did very savvily at the time is to basically take this really great cultural achievement and say like, wow, we're really amazed, like we're really amazing for like putting this out there. And it's not to get like conspiratorial, but then like it's also part of this like larger Disney like branding exercise of like making themselves look woke for a future oriented family entertainment company, right? And so I think
a question for you. Oh,
yes.
Continue.
Sorry. I didn't have to like Glenn Beck there, but
no worries. I mean, my question is, Disney and Marvel are very hyper aware that they have a platform that reaches thousands, millions of children everywhere. So do you think that, this, because they're trying to cater to that platform, it's inherently bad, or is it because of the way that they're approaching this way, the platform that they have?
I think if it's a movie like, say, Wreck-It Ralph 2, where they actually tried very interesting things, like in terms of how to tell like a story about like a toxic friendship or toxic masculinity, or like within Wreck-It Ralph 2, they have this like interesting revision of like all of the princess narratives. Mm-hmm. I think if it's something where they actually very consciously look back on like what they have been doing and what they're known for and try to like forge a new path forward, I think that would be one thing. But I think the difference with Endgame is that it's not earned. They didn't do the work.
Yeah, they have to do the work.
Well, I have a question to ask you about this, right? Or I have a couple questions, a couple thoughts on this, right? Number one is the thing that comes to mind for me as you're talking about how they didn't do the work is that like two things can be true simultaneously, and maybe they're not true simultaneously in this case. But like, I'm going to ask you this question, Ingu. You tell me if two things can be true simultaneously. Okay. Thing number one: it is not cool the way that the MCU time after time underrepresents people of minority groups. And then in this instance, threw some representation in there and then expected to be kind of congratulated, made it part of the PR campaign, made it part of the narrative of the movie. And like that is graceless, to say the least, right? Like that's not cool. That's thing number one. Thing number two is that it can still be a net positive that there is a gay character in this movie. That this is a movie that's going to be seen by potentially tens, if not hundreds of millions of people, and that seeing that representation does have some like seeing a gay character represented in a just like fairly mundane environment without calling too much attention to their sexuality can have a net positive effect. How do you feel about those two things being true at the same time, or do you feel like they're incompatible?
I have this thing, like, I have this, like, nitpicky thing about gay movies where I hate gay movies that, like, fight for acceptance but refuse to show gay sex. And the reason why I bring that up is because I feel like if you're going to demand credit for doing a thing, you should do it all of the way.
So, yeah, okay.
And so I guess, like, with this scene, like, we actually talked about this among the staff writers a lot, this scene about, like, how much credit do the Russo brothers deserve for this gay milestone, or I think, like, someone called it, like, a mile pebble in the Slate Slack. And I think, essentially, like, the people who weighed in who were queer were like, well, that's fine, but it's not like that character has enough of a characterization for me to like relate to that character on any level. Mm-hmm. And so I think that you can make that argument that like any exposure is helpful, but I guess like if you can't like see yourself in it, if there's like nothing there, then what's the point?
I think that's a really valid point. I'll say that as somebody who grew up in like an extremely conservative Christian church, and had like my perspective of homosexuality like filtered through that lens, that seeing a representation like this, if I was a young kid, would have been pretty revelatory to me. You know what I mean? Just because I lived in an environment where I didn't necessarily see that many representations at all. Like just totally, if you totaled them up, it wasn't that many representations. And so I'm kind of like looking at it from that perspective, but I also completely understand what you're saying, that like you can't just throw the reference in there and then expect that is enough, right? If it's like that there are entire stories that deserve to be told about these different subcultures and these different minority groups. And there is this tension about like, do you get the quote unquote woke points if you don't do the work of filling out that representation? But let's talk about.
Can I add one more thing to that? Sorry.
Sure.
So I guess if we're talking about like representation, if you have a character that like people are supposed to see themselves in, you can go one of two ways. You can either look at this character as like a figure of identification where you relate to them. And I think that's the angle that they were going in terms of like, this person is obviously grieving, you're obviously supposed to like feel for them. And so you're creating this like bridge between like the viewer and the character. And I think that's fine. That also seems so like step one, because I think if you have these characters that come from minority groups, from underrepresented groups, there's also the other element of like, this character might be different from you in other ways. And so I guess like the thing that doesn't register to me is that like that person is such a everyman that like, I mean, I get the argument that like why can't a gay person be an everyman? Like, sure, but like I guess it sort of also irks me that like they want credit for gay representation when there's like nothing about them that is like different from the audience on any level. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I want to say that I'm somewhere in between the two of you, because I feel like not like just a little representation isn't enough, but I feel like the first steps are a good sign of progress. Like little steps, especially in a big franchise like this, are a good signal for the future. But my issue lies with the self-congratulatory nature of it all. And that's where moments like the gay moment or the girl power moment ring hollow to me, because like we were saying before, they didn't do the work to get to the big moment that they want to have. But if they were just to acknowledge like they're trying a little bit at a time and they're trying to make their way there, but don't do like the big, marquee moment, then that would be okay with me, because they are obviously in it for the long haul, and they're aware that they have a platform that reaches thousands of children, that any representation, any progress is good, but they need to do more work in the meantime before they go and pat themselves on the back.
Well, I really I don't want to, like, first of all, I want to make clear that I'm not coming from the position of like, yeah, Disney did an amazing job, like they deserve all the praise. Like, I don't feel that way. I feel like at the that as a general matter, that like more representation is better, even if it doesn't quite happen with the level of like fullness that we would all prefer. But that like for a movie this big, even like there's going to be like I'm estimating, thousands of people seeing a gay character on screen for the first time, and that there is some like inherent value in that. But I also think that like, it's only one step. And when you talk about self-congratulatory, like the self-congratulatory nature of it, as I've already said, like it's not necessarily like in the marketing campaign. The directors are asked about it at press events. And so, like, the alternative of what they, I'm curious. I guess I'm curious. Like, that was the question I was going to ask you. Is like, what is the alternative? Is like, should they not talk about it? Should like they say like it's it speaks for itself, and then not say anything more, or like, kind of what is your preference for how they should conduct themselves? Is what I'm genuinely curious about.
Do you guys remember that standalone Star Wars movie that came out like 5 years ago?
Rogue One?
Rogue One or Solo or Star Wars Story?
I think it was like Rogue One that had like
Solo
these,
came out like 2 years ago.
No, not Solo. I think it was Rogue One that had like these like two gay Asian characters.
Yeah, played by Donnie Yen and I can't remember the other actor. Were they gay though? I mean, I feel like maybe it was implied, but it wasn't explicit.
I think it was like I thought that was like implied because I remember seeing something about like, oh, Star Wars finally introduced its like first gay characters or something along those lines. And to me,
Zhang Wang is the other guy's name.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We're all bad Asians here.
Yep. Yep.
I think, like, to me, that was, like, one of those things where it felt more natural because it came from fans who wanted to see themselves represented on screen and were happy about, like, the greater representation in the Star Wars universes. And I think something like that, where, like, the congratulatoriness comes from the fans, just feels so much less gross than like the celebration being like a top-down thing.
Yeah,
I think,
and to be clear, like, so this is like in a Deadline article, right? Like Joe Russo says, quote, "Representation is really important. It was important to us as we did 4 of these films. We wanted a gay character somewhere in them. We felt it was important that one of us play him to ensure the integrity and show it is so important to the filmmakers that one of us is representing that. It is a perfect time because one of the things that is compelling about the Marvel Universe moving forward is its focus on diversity," end quote. And so I think like your one of your beefs is with the tone of how he's saying that. Is that right?
I mean, I guess. I also don't understand their, like, logic for why one of them has to play the gay character.
Sure. But I guess I just want to be, like, extremely precise about what we're talking about when we say, like, self-congratulatory nature is, like, they're giving interviews, they're being asked about this, and they're talking about it in the way that I just described.
I think at a certain point, it just becomes, like, really impossible to separate, like, what progress is like actually being made versus what the marketing is. And for me, like, if we're going back to like this specific scene, to me this was like a marketing thing that like co-opted social justice.
I do want to say, not to pivot from the gay moment, but I felt like the depiction of the girl power scene in and of itself was congratulatory because of the way it was positioned to be this big, again, girl power moment. It felt like a coming together of all these characters, of all the female characters, but because we hadn't seen any of them interact before, or because we'd seen throughout the past like 10 years of movies that they often been sidelined by the male characters, that's where it comes off hollow. And that's where the self-congratulatory nature of that scene, where it's like, the big moment where they're like, we can help, and they all do their super power pose, and it feels like it's going to be an ad for the next like A-Force movie where it's led by a female super team and stuff. So that's where, for me, I the self-congratulatory nature of that scene is more heinous than like the gay character.
Yeah, I agree completely that like it's this girl power moment is clearly like a much bigger, look at how awesome we are that we're representing all these characters. Like it feels like it is more obvious. The meta-textual element of like, look at how awesome the representation is more clearly on display and more flamboyant in the girl power scene.
Also, as my friend April Wolf said, how would all of these like women who are in this like giant chaotic battle know like the precise right moment at which to like all
they
line
have a
up
women radar
and say, "And me"?
Yeah, they have some sort of like signal in which they all come together, and logistically makes no sense that they all like are in the same place.
And also, so many of these characters are so recent. It like really drives home how women have been like or female characters have been this like complete afterthought.
Yeah,
Yes.
so HT, in your piece, you talk about Black Widow and how she hasn't really she hasn't really had a fully formed character. In your opinion, you kind of describe her in Iron Man 2. She's a steely sexpot. In Avengers, she's a tortured killer, and most egregiously in Avengers: Age of Ultron, she's a tragic quote unquote monster. And I think you're referring to the fact that like she refers to how she can't have children in that movie. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And you go on here. The Russo brothers were the first to get a handle on a defining characterization of Black Widow and Captain America: Winter Soldier, a lonely, mistrustful, reformed killer who is seeking some kind of redemption. But as the MCU became more packed with characters and stuff, Black Widow's arc was sidelined again, as she was relegated simply to Captain America's right-hand man in Captain America: Civil War and Avengers: Infinity War, end quote. So I think one of your issues with this moment in the movie, the girl power moment in the movie, let's call it, is how these films have treated Black Widow throughout, right?
Yes.
As one
Black
of the
Widow
only
is-
major female characters in the entire franchise.
Black Widow is kind of ground zero for how Marvel has treated their female characters, in that she has been just so inconsistent throughout all of the movies, and that because of these inconsistencies, she's never been able to develop a fully formed character arc. And because Avengers Endgame especially is about taking in that history of the MCU and what it's leading up to, for her it just feels very like garbled. And her arc doesn't really make any sense in terms of like what she's been doing up until now, and it's a giant disservice to her as a character who has so much potential and shows glimmers of potential in like every version of the character that she's been in. But because the MCU has never been able to settle on something, when they try to fast forward that arc in Avengers Endgame, it just doesn't land, and it feels like she's just sacrificed for the sake of man pain again.
Yeah, and one of the things you point out in this article is also that at the end of the movie, like Black Widow is one of the permanent deaths of the film Avengers Endgame, right? And but at the end of the movie, like no one even mentions her seemingly, right? Like no one even gives a credit. It's all about Tony Stark dying, and like no one even gives a shit about Black Widow.
Tony Stark gets this big elaborate funeral, and Black Widow gets one mention from Hawkeye.
Well, also Hulk threw a bench as well. That also was a thing.
Yeah, this is what, like, they have their little moment of man pain, and then all the action happens. Tony gets that big funeral at the end, and as Hawkeye and Scarlet Witch are talking about their losses, Black Widow finally gets a mention, but otherwise she's just completely gone from the picture.
So, Ingu, in your article, you talk about the Nebula and Gamora character arcs kind of also being short-shrifted. In watching Endgame again, which I went to the theater again this past Saturday, and I rewatched it, and I was like, you know what? The most intriguing things to me about this film were the Nebula aspects of it. And I don't mean intriguing like, oh, they did a great job with the Nebula stuff. Like, I'm like, ooh, I really wish they had gone more down that path. There's a moment earlier on in the movie where Thanos is in his like hut and trying to relax, and then he says, "You know, daughter, perhaps I treated you too harshly," and that's his last words before his head is cut off, and it just hinted at this whole kind of tragic relationship that these two had that I felt like it didn't really have room to breathe because the movie's trying to do too much, right? Can you say more about like what you had hoped for from the Nebula character in this movie?
I don't know if I had any hopes for her, but I feel like with this movie and the Guardians of the Galaxy movies, it's really obvious that like if you wanted like a drama that was like focused on Thanos' relationship with his two daughters and how like incredibly fucked up their relationship became because he would always pit them against each other, and how like one of them was basically like brainwashed into like being murderous toward the other, and then this whole like reconciliation that they had because like the father decided he was going to like kill one of his daughters in order to make himself more powerful. Like if this was like a human story. This could be like a 10-episode season on HBO. Like, there is so much emotional texture there, and there's like so many different elements of this. And so there's like something really like gruesome to me about how first, what's his name? James
Gunn.
Yes. James Gunn gave like these two sisters this like really gruesome history. Didn't really do anything with it. As like a very quick aside, like in Guardians of the Galaxy 2, like you find out that Quill's father killed his mother and you have like this like other domestic abuse story. That's like something also like something that like we move pretty quickly away from because it's just like an impetus for Quill to like kill his dad as like a result of it. And so I feel like you have these stories of like incredible emotional suffering by these like female characters that are never told within like the full blossom that it deserves because like we gotta go shoot the bad guys or punch them or whatever.
I wholly agree with you, Ingu, because I feel like the main failing of the Guardians of the Galaxy films are that they focus so much on Peter Quill when Gamora and Nebula are the infinitely more compelling and fascinating characters who really deserve that central focus for the films. So I do like that she gets to sort of live out some of her arc in this film. And I will say I do actually like kind of where it goes, although it does feel like it falls a little bit short of where she grapples with the abuse that she went through. But yeah, I agree with you, Ingu.
I think just like even their reunion here, where Nebula realizes that she gets this like second chance with Gamora, but then it turns out like she has to like kill herself basically in order to like make that happen. Just like I feel like that's so much emotional complexity there. And this idea that like maybe at some point like she really wasn't salvageable as a person. And so you have this like extremely heavy dark stuff and then like next scene like
potato of the gauntlet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You write here in your article, Endgame's pat appeal to sisterhood, which unites Nebula and Gamora, is symptomatic of its overall treatment of female characters as walking applause lines first and people/space aliens second. Fans are ready to clap for their female favorites, but Marvel should give them something to cheer for first, end quote. And so, like, I think one of your points...
I think really harsh, you guys.
Yeah, yeah. You think? I mean, I think one of the things that this points to is the idea that, like, the movie introduced, like, both between Black Widow and Gamora, like, the movie introduces all this idea of female suffering, right, without really exploring it meaningfully, and that makes a girl power style moment feel more hollow as a result. Is that fair to say?
Yes, I think even going back to like Black Widow's like whole self-described monster thing, I had forgotten this until a friend had reminded me. But like the reason why she is infertile is because she was forcefully sterilized. And so basically, like, for a woman who was, like, again, sterilized, like, against her will, to then call herself a monster for her, like, inability to have children is just such bad writing.
Yeah. So the MCU overall has some stuff to answer for, I think is what you're saying.
I mean, you know what? You want to make, like, crappy movies where you write women terribly, like, that's fine. Don't pat yourself on the back for it.
Right.
Exactly.
So, I mean, so the question I was going to ask you earlier, and actually there's someone in the chat room also has asked the question, is, like, if you, let's say you were, like, movie god, you could go and, like, change movies to your will, right? Would you remove the girl power moment? Like, do you think the universe is worse off as a result of this moment in the film?
Wait, how much of movie god powers do we have?
Let's say you have complete. I mean, I want to hear your complete movie god powers. So, like, let's say you have complete, but like for the purposes of this first question, you can only alter this movie. How about that?
Mm.
Because and the reason I ask, right, is because there are people who enjoyed that moment, right, and like didn't. Like, this interest. It's interesting to see like the reaction to this movie is like. I've seen pieces about like Thor being fat, right, and like how like some people believe that the movie's engaging in fat shaming, and other people think that they watch the movie and they feel seen by the movie, right? And I feel like both of those reactions are valid reactions to have. And so I'm curious, like, if you feel like, in this case, it is also a valid reaction to have enjoyed that moment. Or is it, like, completely bad and should be stricken from the record? I don't personally, like I said, I don't feel like I have a stake in it, but, like, I'm curious what you think about it.
I don't think it's bad to have that reaction to the moment, because I do think people's feelings of joy and empowerment are valid in terms of when they experience and see that moment. For me, if I were to change this movie in any way, I would definitely change Black Widow's arc and give her something a little bit more coherent and something that's a little less just emotional labor and grief before she dies. But for me, that moment, I wouldn't exactly strike it completely from the film, but maybe alter it in a way where it feels more organic, and maybe it's not like every single female character that ever exists in the MCU showing up in this one tiny like area of land, but maybe characters who know each other, characters who have met before, or characters who have some sort of geographic closeness to each other. For me, yeah, I think if there was some sort of build up to this moment, if we had seen any of the other female characters outside of Nebula and Scarlet and Black Widow, if maybe like Captain Marvel, who is at the centerpiece of this moment, doesn't just show up at the beginning and then disappear and then show up at the end for this big girl power moment. If she was able to have more a larger presence throughout this film and be able to like make connections with other female characters or other characters in general, then this moment would work for me.
Yeah. Speaking of like being movie god, I also think the idea that it's Black Widow that sacrifices herself and not Hawkeye does feel a little bit odd to me in retrospect, because it feels like that is Hawkeye's arc. Do you know what I mean? Like he lost his family and then like became a terrible version of himself, like a shell of his former self, and then like but his final redemption is to sacrifice himself for the good of the world. That feels like an arc to me, and for like that,
especially because he killed a bunch of randos.
Yeah,
yeah,
a bunch of random Asian people.
Compelling
That's
to
right.
me too. Yeah.
And then for like Black Widow to take that role, it just feels like there's just not. Doesn't really feel like there's enough there. You know, I guess they've been friends, and like I think he spared her life. I think it was what the storyline was in the Avengers, right? When he was on a mission. And so there is like some connection there, and it's not like completely out of left field, but it does. Given all the other things we've discussed about how the movie, the only moment you have of mourning Black Widow is like right after they come out of the time machine, and there's that look on Steve Rogers and Hulk's face as they realize that Hawkeye's lost Black Widow. It does feel like kind of a missed opportunity to kill Hawkeye. That said,
Black Widow's arc. Oh, I want to say Black Widow's arc does feel incomplete going from A to C, because you see at the beginning that she is really taking hard the snapping, the fact that like they failed the world and like everyone else is doing the same, but she for some reason is taking it even worse than the others, and her motivations are just kind of have always been in flux, but it feels like her central motivation, like her central driving factor here, is that she has always wanted a family. She's always wanted some community in which she can trust. And like for her, the Avengers were that. And like the fact that half of them are gone is why she's so determined to get them back. And just sacrificing herself for her family, to get back her family, but then not actually get to join her family makes no sense to me.
Yeah, you actually described it quite beautifully about like that is really her arc, is like about family. I guess if you put it like that, HT, it's basically like a crapshoot between the two of them. They both have pretty solid motivations. But
No, basically, ScarJo should have like gone and like been. She could have been like a second mom in like Hawkeye's family, and then
Right.
everybody would have been happy. And
Yeah.
you know what? ScarJo is supposed to have her own movie. No one is clamoring for a Hawkeye movie. I do not understand this decision at all.
It's true. It's true. Maybe it felt to me like Scarlett Johansson's contract has run out after 10 years, and she can no longer be in it. Like, it felt more motivated by that than any organic character develvelopments.
But she's getting her prequel movie, so that's not exactly true.
Yeah, yeah. Do we know it's a prequel movie, Ingu? I'm sorry, HT? I can tell the difference between you do.
Wow.
We do we do know it's a prequel movie. I think it's explicitly been said that.
Okay.
I
Well,
mean, it has to be at this point.
so Ingu, if you could be movie god, would you take the girl power moment out of this movie? I think I know the answer, but curious what your thoughts are.
Yes.
You think the world is just you think the world is just worse off to have this moment in there? It is a total loss.
I mean, this article that I wrote went up, and then like a bunch of people that I know personally either like messaged me or texted me about like how much they loved that moment. And so I think one of the reasons why I wanted to get at this like scene and how people really wanted to cheer is that like people really are invested for like in these movies feminism, right? And so it's just sad to me that like you just get like this like hollow version of something that like people really do want and thirst for, and like arguably like something that is like needed in the world. And if my friends want to enjoy this scene for what it is, that's fine. But like I think all of my friends are reasonable enough that they will acknowledge like maybe, I don't know, like Mantis isn't everyone's like top 5 character. But if they want to like cheer for Marvel's like feminism, like, I mean, corporate feminism has won. Like, this is a win now.
You're fighting a losing battle, is what you're saying. But
Let me be cranky in my corner.
I think, you know, the way you put it in your opening paragraph is good. Is like that you are not satisfied with the scraps from Marvel's table, pretty much. Is that accurate? Right? Like that you consider this scraps and like you want the full meal. Is that a fair way to describe it?
Yes. Where's my Valkyrie movie? Give me my Valkyrie movie, and then I will cheer for her. Otherwise, like, you get like 40 minutes of her in Thor 3, the third installment of a movie, and then she shows up here, and we're supposed to like lose our minds. Fuck you.
All right. Well, I think I understand your perspective. I really appreciate both of you sharing it. Is there anything else we didn't cover that you want to mention before we wrap this up?
Why do you feel like it's not incumbent upon you to cheer for Marvel's feminism?
What, like you're saying? Why do I feel like I shouldn't cheer, or why should I don't? Can you repeat the question?
I guess you imply that like that moment was like not for you because there was like. And I guess, like, to me, it sounded like there was no incentive for you to, like, cheer for greater female representation in the Marvel movies. Am I, like, misconstruing your reaction?
Yeah, no, I think you're misconstruing. You know, I don't think I shouldn't... I think it's more like the moment was so... The moment felt very blatantly pandering to an audience that wasn't me. Does that make sense? Like, that's what I was trying to communicate. I'm obviously for more representation, and so, you know, like even in corporate forms. But for me, it just felt like somebody was trying to say something, and like that it wasn't directed at me. It was directed at like other people who, you know, took it in good and bad ways. Does that make any sense, Ingu?
Yes, it makes sense.
Yeah. I don't want the perception to be that like I'm not for representation, but it's also like that is also kind of the reaction you had when I read this article is similar to the reaction like that was like starting to form in my mind as I was watching it. Is that like this movie wants you to get up and cheer during that moment? Has it earned that? Does it deserve that? And I don't know that it's like my place to say. That's kind of how I feel about it. But
I think that's a good position to take. Yeah. Good public position to take.
That is my public position, and I am not deviating from it.
Let me support women who have something to say about it.
Yes, that's what I'm trying to do. So, HT, any closing thoughts as we wrap up today?
No, I think I've touched on everything I've wanted to say. I will say that like I see where Marvel was coming from in terms of just like trying to bring some more representation to their platform, but the way they're going about it is the wrong way because of that self-congratulatory nature and just like their track record in general. And if they do want to take steps forward, then they should work harder behind the scenes and just like drive and focus on the characters versus focusing on the marquee moments that those characters serve.
I think that's a great place to leave it. Ingu Kang is a staff culture writer at Slate. She also wrote this article, "The worst scene in Endgame is the one that's supposed to be the most feminist." Ingu, thanks for joining me today. Where can people find more of your work on the internet?
Slate.com.
And HT, you've written this piece at /film called "The Women of Marvel Deserve More in Avengers Endgame." Where can people find more of your work on the internet?
You can find me at /film.com, and I'm on Twitter at htranbilly.
All right, and thanks for listening to this episode of the /Filmcast. You can find more episodes at /filmcast.com. And next week, we are going to be back. I think we're going to be reviewing Detective Pikachu. I think that movie comes out this week, right?
Yes.
So, yeah.
Good luck.
So that's what we'll be discussing next week on the /Filmcast. Thanks for listening to this bonus episode. We'll see you